Based on Stephen King's terrifying novel, Pet Sematary, 1989, became one of the most chilling horror films of its time. With its eerie atmosphere, unsettling themes, and unforgettable scares, it left a lasting mark on horror fans. But how much do you really know about it? From behind-the-scenes challenges to eerie real-life events, here are 15 things you didn't know about Pet Sematary. Zelda was played by a man, and it made her even scarier. One of the most disturbing and memorable characters in Pet Sematary is Zelda, Rachel Creed's terminally ill sister who suffered from spinal meningitis. Her gaunt, twisted body and agonizing screams left a lasting impression on audiences, making her one of the most terrifying figures in the film. But what makes Zelda even more unsettling is the fact that she wasn't played by a woman at all. She was portrayed by a fully grown man. Andrew Hubatsek, the actor behind Zelda, was cast because his tall, thin frame gave the character an unnatural, almost inhuman appearance. The film's director, Mary Lambert, wanted Zelda to feel otherworldly, and having a male actor in heavy prosthetics created an effect that was deeply disturbing. The choice made Zelda look not just sick, but grotesquely exaggerated, as if she had already become something monstrous before her death. Adding to the horror, Zelda's death scene, where she calls out to Rachel in agony, feels more like a living nightmare than a memory. Her presence haunts not only Rachel but also the audience, making Zelda one of the most terrifying non-supernatural elements in Pet Sematary. The directors who turned down the project, even George A. Romero, walked away before Mary Lambert brought Pet Sematary to life. The film was almost directed by a very different horror legend, George A. Romero, the mastermind behind Night of the Living Dead. Romero acquired the rights to the novel in 1984 and was eager to adapt it, given his expertise in stories about the undead. With his signature gritty style, Romero's version of Pet Sematary might have been even darker and gorier than the final film. However, Romero's schedule was packed. He was tied up with Day of the Dead and other projects, ultimately forcing him to step away from Pet Sematary. As a result, the rights ended up being sold to Paramount Pictures, who began the search for a new director. Another unexpected name that surfaced? Tom Savini, the legendary makeup artist behind Dawn of the Dead and Friday the 13th. Savini was reportedly considered to direct but never officially joined the project. Ultimately, Mary Lambert was chosen, and she brought a unique vision to the film. Her background in music videos helped create a stylized, eerie atmosphere that set Pet Sematary apart from other horror films of the era. Stephen King's real-life tragedies inspired the story. Unlike many of his other novels, which are purely products of his imagination, Pet Sematary was born from Stephen King's real-life nightmares. It's one of the few stories King has admitted genuinely scares him, and for good reason. It was inspired by a personal tragedy that almost happened. In the late 1970s, King and his family were living in a remote house near Orono, Maine. The house sat dangerously close to a busy road, where trucks would speed by constantly. One day, King's young son, Owen, wandered too close to the highway, and in a moment of sheer terror, King rushed to grab him before a truck could hit him. This near tragedy shook King to his core, planting the seed for Gage Creed's fate in Pet Sematary. Adding to the real-life horror, the family's beloved cat, Smucky, was killed on the same road. King and his daughter buried Smucky in a makeshift pet cemetery behind their house, much like the one in the novel. Years later, when King wrote Pet Sematary, he used these personal experiences to craft a story that felt deeply real and emotionally devastating. It's no wonder he has since called it the one book he found too disturbing to reread. Church was played by 7 different cats, a team of feline nightmares. The gray British shorthair known as Church may have been one cat in the story, but in reality it took 7 different cats to bring the undead menace to life on screen. Each cat was trained for specific actions, as no single feline could perform all the required movements consistently. One cat was used for hissing, another was trained to stay completely still, and yet another specialized in creeping menacingly toward the camera. This meticulous approach ensured that Church always looked unsettling in every scene. However, working with multiple cats also created logistical challenges for the crew. To maintain continuity, The cats had to undergo extensive grooming to make sure their fur always looked the same. Trainers also used specific hand signals and food rewards to encourage the cats to hit their marks. Despite the difficulty, the final result was terrifyingly effective. The moment Church returns from the dead, his glowing yellow eyes and eerie stillness instantly signal that something is deeply wrong. The performance of 7 different cats combined into one iconic horror pet, proving that sometimes it takes a team effort to create the perfect nightmare. Bruce Campbell was almost cast as Louis Creed, a completely different version of the film. Before Dale Midkiff was cast as Louis Creed, the role was almost given to none other than Bruce Campbell, the legendary star of Evil Dead. Campbell's signature style, a mix of horror, action, and dark humor, would have made Pet Sematary feel entirely different. Campbell was already a cult horror star by the late 1980s, and his charismatic presence might have added a more exaggerated, pulpy tone to the film. While his casting would have made for an interesting take, the studio ultimately opted for a more serious approach, choosing Midkiff instead. Midkiff's performance, while restrained, helped ground the film in realistic horror, keeping it faithful to King's novel. Had Campbell taken the role, Pet Sematary might have leaned closer to Evil Dead, blending dark comedy with gore rather than the slow-burning tragedy it became. Though Campbell never played Louis Creed, horror fans can only imagine what Pet Sematary would have looked like with Ash Williams himself, facing off against Church and an undead Gage. There was a sequel. Starring Edward Furlong, and Stephen King wanted nothing to do with it. After Pet Sematary became a box office success, a sequel seemed inevitable. In 1992, Pet Sematary 2 was released, starring Edward Furlong, who had just gained fame as John Connor in Terminator 2: Judgment Day. But while director Mary Lambert returned, the film was a completely different beast, and not in a good way. Unlike the first film, which focused on grief and the consequences of bringing back the dead, the sequel leaned heavily into over-the-top horror and campy violence. Instead of a grieving father, the story followed a teenager, Furlong's character, who moves to Ludlow, Maine, after his mother's tragic death. Unsurprisingly, the ancient burial ground is disturbed once again, leading to more undead chaos. Stephen King was so unhappy with the direction of the sequel that he demanded his name be removed from the credits. Paramount had originally considered making the movie about Ellie Creed, the surviving daughter from the first film, but they scrapped that idea and replaced her with a male lead. Although Pet Sematary 2 was widely panned, it did have one redeeming factor: Clancy Brown's performance. The actor, best known as the Kurgan in Highlander, played a sadistic sheriff who comes back from the dead, delivering a performance that was so unhinged it became the highlight of the film. The eerie cat Yowl, a Hollywood staple that started with Pet Sematary. Few sounds in Pet Sematary are as unsettling as the demonic yowl of Church, the resurrected family cat. The unnatural, hair-raising screech became synonymous with the film's eerie atmosphere, but what many don't know is that this sound has been used far beyond Pet Sematary. This particular cat screech is known as the Wilhelm meow, a feline counterpart to the famous Wilhelm scream. It was recorded in the late 1980s by sound designer Wiley Stateman, featuring a part Siamese cat named Cheetah. The unnerving quality of this yowl made it instantly recognizable, and it soon became a go-to sound effect in Hollywood. Since then, the Wilhelm meow has cropped up in numerous films, including other horror movies, action films, and even comedies. It has been layered into scenes whenever filmmakers needed a chilling, over-the-top cat sound, sometimes even in movies that don't feature cats at all. The use of Cheetah's voice in Pet Sematary was particularly effective because it made Church's transformation from a normal pet to a sinister creature even more disturbing. Every time the cat let out that eerie screech, it served as a reminder that whatever had come back wasn't the same Church that was buried. Miko Hughes had a dummy double for the intense scenes, and for good reason. It's hard to believe that Miko Hughes was only 2 years old when he played Gage Creed in Pet Sematary. His chilling performance, from his innocent giggles to his murderous smirks, made Gage one of the creepiest horror children ever put on screen. But as talented as he was, Many of the film's most intense scenes were simply too dangerous or disturbing for a toddler to act out. To ensure his safety, the filmmakers created a lifelike dummy double of Miko, which was used for particularly violent moments. This included scenes where Gage attacks Judd Crandall, as well as his final moments when Lewis injects him with a lethal dose of morphine. In some shots, the dummy was manipulated using puppetry and camera tricks, making it appear as though Gage was moving in unnatural ways. This effect added to the horror, making the character seem even more unsettling. Despite the use of a dummy stand-in, Hughes still delivered a remarkably eerie performance, proving that sometimes a child's laughter can be more terrifying than a scream. The film was directed by a music video director, and it shows. While Pet Sematary is one of the most memorable horror films of the late 1980s, it wasn't directed by a typical horror filmmaker. Instead, it was helmed by Mary Lambert, a director best known for her work in the music industry. Lambert had previously directed some of the most famous music videos of the 80s, including Madonna's Like a Virgin and Material Girl. Her background in music videos gave Pet Sematary a unique visual style, filled with dreamlike imagery, haunting slow-motion sequences, and surreal, gothic lighting. Lambert's experience in crafting mood-driven visuals helped elevate the film, making it feel more artistic and unsettling compared to other horror movies of the time. Scenes like Rachel's nightmarish visions of Zelda and Lewis's slow, grief-filled descent into madness were filmed almost like a music video, with stylized lighting and eerie camera movements. Though Lambert's Hollywood career never quite reached the heights of her music video days, Pet Sematary remains one of the most stylish and eerie horror films of its era. Proof that sometimes an unexpected director can bring something truly unique to a film. The Wendigo was removed from the film, a lost element of ancient horror. In Stephen King's novel, the ancient burial ground wasn't just a mystical place. It was cursed by a Wendigo, a malevolent Native American spirit that fed on human flesh and lured people into making dark choices. In the book, Louis Creed even encounters the creature in a terrifying moment, hinting that it's the true source of the burial ground's dark power. Early drafts of the Pet Sematary script included the Wendigo, with plans to visually depict it on screen. The idea was to make the entity a lurking presence, watching as Lewis made his tragic decisions. However, as production moved forward, the filmmakers felt the story was already terrifying enough without adding a supernatural monster. Instead, they shifted focus to psychological horror, keeping the Wendigo's influence subtle. Its presence is still hinted at in the film, especially in Judd Crandall's chilling warnings about the burial ground's evil nature. However, for those who have read the novel, the absence of the Wendigo remains one of the film's biggest deviations from King's original vision. The brutal ending was added at the last minute because the original was too tame. The ending of Pet Sematary is one of the most shocking moments in horror cinema. As Louis Creed, driven mad by grief, buries his wife Rachel in the forbidden burial ground, she returns, her rotting corpse sneaking up behind him. As they embrace, we hear the sickening sound of a knife being lifted, followed by Lewis's blood-curdling scream as the screen cuts to black. But this wasn't the original ending. The initial version was far more subdued, simply showing Rachel's return, but leaving her fate, and Louis' unclear. When Paramount executives watched the first cut, they demanded something darker. They felt the ending wasn't shocking enough and needed a final, brutal moment to leave audiences disturbed. In response, the crew rushed to film the now iconic knife scene, ensuring the film ended on a truly horrifying note. The result? An unforgettable, nightmarish conclusion that cemented Pet Sematary as one of the most disturbing horror films of its time. Filming locations stayed true to the novel's setting because Stephen King insisted. Unlike many Hollywood adaptations that change locations for convenience, Pet Sematary remained faithful to Stephen King's original setting. The reason? King himself demanded it. Since the story takes place in Maine, King insisted that the film be shot there as well, rather than using a generic New England town. The production team honored his request, filming in various Maine locations to bring his vision to life. The towns of Bangor and Ellsworth served as primary filming sites, while the Pet Sematary scenes were filmed in a forest near Ellsworth, one of the most atmospheric locations. The approach to the Mi'kmaq burial ground was shot at an abandoned granite quarry on Mount Desert Island, within Acadia National Park. This commitment to authenticity gave Pet Sematary an added layer of realism, making its creeping dread feel all the more believable. For fans of King's work, the film's locations serve as a perfectly haunting recreation of his terrifying novel. Stephen King's cameo as a minister, a direct connection to his darkest story. Stephen King is no stranger to making cameos in the film adaptations of his works, and Pet Sematary is no exception. In this particular appearance, King plays a minister, delivering a somber funeral sermon during the burial of Missy Dandridge. Though his role is brief, it adds a personal and eerie touch to the film. For King, Pet Sematary is one of his most unsettling stories. Even he has admitted that it genuinely scares him. So, seeing him standing over a coffin, reading scripture about death and resurrection, makes the scene feel even more chilling. It's as if the creator himself is watching over his characters, witnessing the horrors he set into motion. Unlike other King cameos where he plays quirky shopkeepers or background characters, this role feels more symbolic. The funeral scene represents the first major death in the film, foreshadowing the much darker events to come. King's presence is a subtle but powerful nod to his deep connection with the story, one that was inspired by his own near-tragic experiences. The Ramones' contribution to the soundtrack, a punk rock twist to horror Stephen King, isn't just the master of horror. He's also a massive rock fan. One of his favorite bands? The Ramones. So, when Pet Sematary was being adapted into a film, King personally invited the legendary punk band to contribute a song for the soundtrack. The result? Pet Sematary, a track that perfectly captures the film's dark, eerie themes with its haunting lyrics and driving punk energy. The song plays during the end credits, leaving audiences with a sense of unease even after the final scene has faded to black. What makes this collaboration even more special is that the Ramones weren't just randomly chosen. They were actually huge King fans, and the feeling was mutual. Their song, with lyrics like "I don't want to be buried in a pet cemetery," became one of their most recognizable tracks, forever linking punk rock and horror cinema. To this day, Pet Sematary remains one of the most memorable horror movie theme songs, proving that sometimes the best soundtracks come from unexpected collaborations. Guillermo del Toro's aspiration to adapt Pet Sematary, a horror master's dream project. Over the years, many directors have taken a stab at adapting Stephen King's works, but one filmmaker has publicly expressed his deep desire to tackle Pet Sematary, none other than Guillermo del Toro. Known for his dark fantasy and gothic horror films, del Toro has long admired King's novel, calling it one of the most profound horror stories ever written. Unlike previous adaptations, which focused primarily on zombie horror, del Toro has specific visions for certain scenes that were left out of earlier versions, particularly the Wendigo and the deeper mythology of the burial ground. While del Toro has yet to officially take on the project, his passion for Pet Sematary proves that the novel's legacy endures, and in the hands of a visionary director, it could be reimagined in an entirely new way. Fans can only hope that one day del Toro will get the chance to bring his terrifying version of Pet Sematary to life. Decades later, Pet Sematary remains one of the most disturbing and unforgettable adaptations of Stephen King's work. Whether you love it for its psychological horror or its chilling storyline, its legacy is undeniable. Which fact surprised you the most? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into classic horror films.